Rigdon. So practice is a serious test. It is one thing to read religious legends and dream that you will become the same spiritual person like their characters, and it is quite another to really work on yourself in each day, do spiritual practices, and control your thoughts. In treatises of Buddhism, for example, the ability of a person to control his supernatural powers is called possessing miraculous powers. It is also said there that a perfect person can influence the world right up to the heavens of Brahma, the seventh dimension, and that the way to the heavens of Brahma starts with the renunciation of the attachment to the 6 worlds of passion of the wheel of life. For example, in the collection of the Buddhist sacred texts, Tripitaka, there is a very interesting sutra called the Fruits of Reclusion. By the way, the word sutra, when translated from Sanskrit, literally means a thread on which pearls are strung. In ancient Indian literature, they called a fragmentary utterance so, and later a collection of such utterances. However, while reading the collection of the Buddhist sacred texts Tripitaka, including the sutra The Fruits of Reclusion, one must bear in mind that these texts contain not the actual words of Buddha, but his teaching, which for a long time was passed down by word of mouth and which was written down later. Besides, as the religion of Buddhism was being formed, changes were made to it over the centuries. In other words, one must be aware of the fact that this is not the original information, but already its interpretation by many minds over centuries. If a person is unaware of subtleties of the spiritual work and lacks practical experience of meditation, he will naturally be retelling, interpreting, or translating this information into other languages while being guided solely by his own worldview and his own understanding on this matter, so to say, from the perspective of a resident of a 3-dimensional world. So the sutra mentions Buddha's conversation with Ajatashatru, king of Magadha, of an ancient country that was once located in northeast India. The king asks Buddha what is the visible fruit of reclusion, that is, what is the result of doing spiritual practices in this world. Buddha, using everyday allegories that can be understood by a common man, recounts the teaching of the path, which a monk who is seeking to get to nirvana walks as a person who is engaged in spiritual self-perfection and meditations. This sutra also mentions that a monk must follow the commandments of moral behavior. It tells about the joys of self-restraint and about the outcome of spiritual work on yourself. Furthermore, it emphasizes that the monk understands the result of the work with the mind which is in samadhi, a pure, clear one, obedient and collected, which has achieved dispassion. The state of samadhi, when translated from Sanskrit, means adding together, joining, integrity, unity. In the Indian philosophy, this state of enlightenment and supreme harmony is seen as the ultimate goal of meditation practices. In Buddhism, samadhi is considered to be the final stage of the Eightfold Path, which according to their philosophy must bring man right up to nirvana. This sutra also mentions this body of mine has a shape and consists of 4 great elements. In philosophical discussions, the 4 great elements are usually interpreted as air, earth, water, and fire. Such allegories by which the ancients meant the 4 main essences were often used in sacred scriptures while discussing self-perfection of man and his energy structure, which is invisible to the eye. Sutra 87 of the Fruits of Reclusion describes a manifestation of various superpowers in a person who has achieved the state of samadhi. He, being one, becomes many, and being many becomes one. He becomes visible to the eye and invisible. He easily passes through walls, ramparts, mountains, as if through the air. He penetrates the earth as if through water. He walks on water like on terra firma, without sinking. Sitting with his legs crossed, he ascends to the sky like a winged bird. He can touch the moon and the sun with his palm. Although they're strong and powerful, up to the heavens of Brahma, he can exert influence by means of his body. It is not the physical body that is meant here. This sutra mentions what Buddhists call the acquired, phenomenal, mystical body. The Sanskrit name in English transcription is Nirmanakaya, that is, a ghostly, transformed body of experiences. From this body of his, he creates another body which has a form, consists of the mind, is endowed with all the big and small parts, and which knows no detriment to vital abilities. At that, there is confusion even in this matter, and endless theoretical discussions take place about what this phenomenal body really means. The body of transformation, of a different state of consciousness, the physical body of Buddha or Bodhisattva, a body of an illusion, manifestation, or the perfect potential of the mind as a physical form. Such disagreements indicate that people have lost the essence of the main knowledge and judge it only by the remaining external forms, and that coming from the human mind. But in reality, everything is simple. The energy body, which is located in 6 dimensions, is approximately the same in humans. It has the form of a 4-sided truncated pyramid with a detached top. It is just that most people do not see it and do not even know it exists. But it does not mean that it does not influence their lives, fate, and activity. As people say, as long as your liver does not hurt, you don't think about it, if of course you know it exists. When a person works on himself, carries out spiritual practices, and takes daily care of the liberation of his soul, his energy structure changes and gradually transforms into a qualitatively different structure, which I have already mentioned. And when the personality merges with the soul, a new spiritual being is formed, which no longer needs the material shell. In other words, thanks to this, a resident of 3-dimensional space becomes a resident of 7-dimensional space. Anastasia. From the standpoint of the gained spiritual experience and the understanding of the key to that primordial knowledge which you've given us, those arguments of theorists seem quite ridiculous. Sometimes the discussions described in their treatises resemble a situation with 2 students who have memorized different theories by heart and argue with each other, shouting themselves hoarse about the essence of a practical production process. However, neither of them has personal experience of working in production. That is, there is no understanding of what production really is. Against the backdrop of such philosophical debates, those authors noticeably stand out who do not talk nonsense, but who really share their practical spiritual experience with the world while walking the spiritual path, even though intuitively at some points, but still in the right direction. One knows about this because one has personal practical experience. After all, acquiring your own practical experience helps to feel and to understand, as they say without further ado, those truly wise people who left their records through the ages and really engaged in working on themselves in the process of surmounting their spiritual path. Rigdon. Certainly, in this matter, there are no borders or divisions, time or material space. What is present here is integrity and spiritual understanding, so to say unity with the truth. So different religions of India have preserved records in one form or another that during his spiritual development, man acquires certain miraculous powers, Buddhism, or siddhi powers, Indian yoga. The ancient Indian word siddha means perfect. The concept of siddhi is also present both in Jainism and Hindu mythology as the name of mythical semi-divine beings possessing preternatural magical powers and inhabiting airspace. According to the ancient Indian Puranas, when translated from Sanskrit, Purana means ancient, a heroic epic story, which describe cosmological myths about the universe and outline Hindu philosophies. Semi-divine cities have the following supernatural properties. They can become extremely light or heavy, infinitely small or large. They can instantly move to any point in space, achieve a desired result with the power of thought, subjugate objects and time to their will, and achieve supreme power over the world. But mythology is merely camouflaged sacred knowledge about human and the world. Anastasia. So basically, these are all echoes of the past knowledge about the mastering by man of practices to control his four essences. Rigdon. Absolutely right. Moreover, they have already been thoroughly reworked by different religions. In fact, these supernatural miraculous powers in a spiritual practice are, one can say, a side effect when a person learns to control his right and left essences. It is the work of these essences in a certain, let us put it this way, mode of consciousness that manifests these superpowers in man. In Buddhist treatises, for instance, references have been preserved that having these powers, siddhis, as such is not harmful, for everything depends on man's choice, his desire. The treatises also say that Buddha himself warned monks against succumbing to various temptations in the process of unconditioning themselves. First of all, they would avoid demonstrating these miraculous powers to people who were not privy to these things, so as not to cause confusion in the minds of unbelievers. Secondly, and most importantly, they were to be wary of temptation to change their initial goal, escape to nirvana, to eternity, for empty human wishes, desire of power, magic takeover of the world, satisfying any material desires and needs, as well as longing for control and possession of anything, the possibilities of using these invisible powers for egoistic purposes and taking advantage of events. In other words, Buddha warned those walking the spiritual path against any use of these miraculous powers for personal gain. Otherwise, a person will stray from the spiritual path and will not accomplish the main goal in his life, inner transformation, fusion with the Absolute, with the world of the soul. Why did Buddha emphasize this point? Buddha had a group of disciples who were mastering the high art, as they called it, or as we say, giliership. This is a difficult path of spiritual development, and it is not meant for everyone. Figuratively speaking, this is like in reconnaissance. Not everyone who wants to be is accepted there, but only the ones who have certain personal qualities, abilities, and already existing professional skills. However, other people knew about this group of Buddhas, as they say, ones who wished to but were not participating. There have always been plenty of imitators distorting the knowledge. It must be noted that during Buddha's time, just like nowadays, many people were keen on magic and various mystical arts of secret knowledge for the sake of their egoistic desire to have invisible power over people. But it is one thing to have supernatural powers for the sake of egoistic goals and pridefulness, and quite another to use such abilities in service to the spiritual world. So Buddha warned his disciples that while passing the stages of inner transformation, it is necessary to firmly adhere to spiritual liberation, your main spiritual goal, that is exit to nirvana, as the only meaning of human existence. Otherwise, one can fall into illusion and mistake the temporary for the eternal. Anastasia. Yes, it was quite popular in ancient India for a person to acquire different supernatural powers one way or another. One can say this was a publicity stunt to popularize different religions. For example, besides the Buddhist religion, this is present in esoteric Daishans, teachings of the ancient Indian philosophy, which describes yogic methods of attaining true knowledge by means of acquiring divine abilities through spiritual practices. In particular, esoteric schools still use such a notion as Shakti as a designation of the powers that can be acquired at various stages of the practices. For instance, Jnana Shakti means powers related to the properties of clairvoyance, clairaudience, and telepathy. Kriya Shakti relates to materialization, the ability to heal or harm with the power of thought. Ichha Shakti stands for manifestation of willpower and self-control, leading to the development of supernatural abilities of the body and the ability of astral projection. Mantra Shakti means powers related to cosmic rhythms and influence on nature. Rigdan. Exactly so. When translated from Sanskrit, Shakti means power, might. Ancient Indian legends, as I have already said, mention Shakti as the primary divine creating power of the feminine principle on the scale of the universe, Adi Shakti. In spiritual practices, this power is mentioned as forces endowed with the functions of Allat and humans' four essences. In religious legends, this creating force is represented in the form of goddesses who are the spouses of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, as well as an aspect of each and every god. Interestingly, it is mentioned that this power, Shakti, branches into smaller forces represented by special signs on lotus petals, in which not only gods but also goddesses live personally. For an uninformed person, such information looks like an ordinary religious legend, while a knowledgeable person understands perfectly what this means and what knowledge about macrocosm and man is outlined. As I have already said, ancient people, particularly in the East, allegorically compared the human energy structure to the lotus flower, where every conventional petal is one of the human essences which has its sign, lives its own life, and is responsible for the connection with a certain dimension. By knowing the sign, one can contact a specific essence directly. Anastasia. Yes, many religions have echoes of this knowledge. It's just that they have been wrapped up into such a material philosophy that it is difficult for an uninformed person not only to separate, but even to understand where spiritual grains are and where there are material additions from the human mind or substitutions from the animal mind. By the way, I recall that Chinese Taoism also regards the human body as a microcosm inhabited by various deities. Although they imagine this process in their own way, which as they understand it, is associated with the physical body and its organs. Nevertheless, it is recommended for followers of Taoism to lead a righteous life and do good deeds, supposedly in order to gain the goodwill of the spirits of the human body. Rigdan. Taoism inherited this knowledge already from ancient Chinese shamanism, where there existed the idea of a multitude of souls in a human, including the animal soul, Po, and the spiritual one, Han, which the body bound together. But there is a significant difference here and a substitution of notions already since those times. The fact is that gaining the goodwill of spirits or coming to an agreement with them actually meant making a deal with the animal mind, which due to such an implied contract made it possible for a person to perform any magical actions within 6 dimensions. The person, shaman, naively believed that the spirits served him when actually he was the one who served as a conductor of the animal mind, and these spirits could change their attitude towards him at any moment. In other words, there is a significant difference between winning the favor of spirits including your own lateral essences, in order to have supernatural powers in the material world in your transient life, or learning to control your essences, gaining integrity, and attaining spiritual liberation, eternity. In the religion of Taoism, just like in the religion of Buddhism, a follower is also charged with the obligation to engage in the radical transformation of his body and consciousness, and use meditations as a tool of cognition. Taoism also emphasizes the fact that thanks to such transformation on the path of attaining immortality, according to their religious teaching, man acquires supernatural powers and abilities. For example, he can become invisible, travel in space, appear simultaneously in several places, compress time, and so on. Yet here's what I would like to say in this regard. Indeed, many religious concepts mention that the follower, while walking the proposed religious path, can eventually learn to have certain supernatural abilities. This attracts many people precisely from the side of the animal nature, moreover, more than spiritual grains. But sadly, many people spend their entire lives on achieving this goal, gaining supernatural abilities, wasting their energy for nothing. However, having supernatural abilities is far from the peak of perfection. There is an ancient wisdom. When man does not know God in his soul, he is ready to believe in anything. To learn some supernatural abilities does not mean to attain spiritual liberation. After all, this can be done, for instance, by people engaged in black magic, that is, by the ones who are conductors of the animal mind. But what is the result? Becoming a subpersonality and undergoing even greater torment in the future? After all, you will have to answer in double measure for all your actions, both in the visible and in the invisible worlds. Developing supernatural abilities is justified only when the person himself does not pay close attention to this process, when he is focused on his spiritual path and spiritual liberation, and at the same time, when he takes on, let us put it this way, an obligation to bear responsibility of a warrior of light from the spiritual world. But this path is only for very few, and mostly people do not need to focus on having any supernatural powers. The main thing for people in their lives is to concentrate their efforts on spiritual liberation, which means spiritual work on themselves in each day. That is the most important thing. It is not people you should prove to that you're better than others. It is God to whom you must prove that you're worthy of being accepted into the spiritual world, that you're worthy of having your personality abide in eternity as a mature spiritual being. Anastasia. Yes, many religions also point at the fact that these abilities are revealed at the last stage of attainment of the truth, when, as it happens, they're basically no longer needed for earthly purposes. Rigdon. Just so, when the fusion of the personality with the soul takes place, and the seventh dimension becomes accessible to man, he already lives in it with consciousness and abides in the spiritual world. He loses all interest in the three-dimensional world, for he begins to learn all the most interesting things in the spiritual world. Generally speaking, the entire spiritual journey of man is a path of his inner conscious changes, of his radical transformation of himself. When the personality begins its journey, it does not understand many things and follows the path by intuition. Everyone bumps into their own obstacles in the process of spiritual movement and learns to overcome them. Cognizing himself, a human begins to understand the invisible side of his life, the previously uncontrolled activity of his own essences, which gave rise to not the best events in his life. So the personality realizes the root of its suffering. When man begins to understand more than is favorable to his animal nature, he ignores the needs of his egoistic existence and cultivates the habit of continual readiness to repel its attacks. Over time, this work on oneself bears spiritual fruit. It is no coincidence that it has been said, "Thought which is well guarded is the bearer of happiness." Personal choice plays a major role in a person's life. Thoughts are always dominated by that to which the personality is not indifferent. Man should monitor the situation in himself more often, observe what he thinks about, and ask himself what he chooses here and now, the suffering of this world or the eternity for himself and his soul. After all, the most important thing in life is the salvation of one's soul. By saving his soul, man also saves himself. Life, even the longest one, ends very quickly, and it ends suddenly. Every moment of living in the material world devours time mercilessly. By the way, the Sanskrit word "ad," the Russian transcription of the word hell, means to eat, to devour, and to consume, or using the old Russian word "жрать," gorge. Ancient people regarded this material world as that very place which religions today call hell, and it was depicted as a monster which devours people, their fates and souls. But if a person yearns day and night to save his soul and works on himself each day, then this gives him a chance to forever leave the boundaries of the material world, to go beyond suffering and constant rebirths. In order to save your soul, it is necessary to live by this desire. This must be the only dominant desire of man in his life, regardless of the circumstances of fate. But human, as a rule, even when he steps on a spiritual path, walks along it with a load of numerous banal earthly wishes, among the temptations of which it is somewhat difficult for him to keep that only wish that comes from the spiritual nature. So his questions often come from the mind. There is a good parable in this regard. A young man once came to a sage who was sitting in the lotus position at a river bank. He decided to pay his respects to the sage and to show with his whole appearance and mind that he was ready to become his disciple. The young man considered it necessary to ask him the question which, as he thought, the sage would certainly answer, and thus turn his attention to him. The young man asked, "What should I do to become wise and save my soul?" But contrary to his expectations, the sage did not reply to him, just like to other people who were coming up to him almost the entire day, asking their questions, complaining about problems, or simply expressing their respect for him. The young man decided to persevere, and so every time somebody asked the sage about something, he repeated his important question again and again. But the sage still remained silent. It so happened that towards the evening, a poor man carrying a heavy load approached the sage, who was still sitting in the lotus position, and asked which road he needed to take in order to reach the nearest town. The sage quickly rose to his feet, hoisted the poor man's load onto himself, took him to the road, pointed the direction, and explained in detail how to get to the town. Then he came back and sat down to meditate again. The young man was so amazed by what had happened that he started asking the sage desperately, "How so? Why have you replied to this man's mundane question and spared him so much time, while I spent the whole day asking you a more important question about the salvation of the soul, yet you have given me no answer?" The sage stood up and gestured for the young man to follow him towards the river. He entered the water. The young man followed him reluctantly, although the water was cold and the wind was piercing. The sage went in to a sufficient depth. He turned to the young man and suddenly seized him by the shoulders. He then quickly immersed the young man into the water up to the top of his head, despite the latter's desperate attempts to break free from his strong arms. Finally, the sage released the young man, who after hastily resurfacing started breathing greedily and could not get enough. The sage calmly asked, "When you were under the water, what did you desire the most in your life?" The young man blurted out without hesitation, "Air. I wanted only air." The sage clarified, "Was it only air? Perhaps at that moment you would instead have preferred to have wealth, fame, pleasures, significance among people, or power over them." The young man almost cried, "What? I longed only for air and was thinking only about air. Without it, I would have died." The sage nodded at the young man contentedly and replied, "Now then, in order to become wise, you must desire to save your soul just as strongly as you were just wishing for air to save your life. This must be your only goal, for which you must fight in your life. This must be your only aspiration, both day and night. If you work on yourself for the sake of saving your soul with the same fervor as you have now been fighting underwater for your life, you will definitely become wise and save yourself." Having said these words, he started to come out of the water, in which the young man, who began to see clearly after the sage's words, was still standing, no longer noticing either the cold or the piercing wind. The sage, after reaching the bank, looked back and said, "As for the common man with the load, I helped him only because today he was the only one out of everybody who was really searching exactly for what he was asking about." Anastasia. It's a marvelous parable, and it describes very accurately both secret desires of many people who only dream of the spiritual path and the state of a person who truly craves spiritual salvation and does much for it. Rigdon. The journey of attaining inner freedom always begins with the first step. At the initial stages of gaining knowledge, a person is indeed full of many banal earthly desires, which are so tempting that without having practical spiritual experience, it is difficult for him to maintain that only aspiration which comes from the spiritual nature. The mistake of many is that at the first stages, they do not even notice that they treat the spiritual not as their main path, but as some addition to their lives, which in a sense have already been formed according to habits, certain patterns of thinking, and so on. There is a big difference here. It is one thing to really change yourself and your habits, and another to wish to acquire greater importance in this world with the help of this knowledge without changing yourself. When a human knows nothing about his spiritual, each day he is filled drop by drop, like a jug, with evil thoughts, defective feelings, and empty wishes. As a result, this mass of material dirt reshapes his further destiny, whereas when a person walks the spiritual path, he observes, figuratively speaking, purity of his thoughts' droplets, with which he fills his consciousness daily, giving attention to them and confirming his choice. Over time, his consciousness gets into the habit of concentrating only on kind thoughts and feelings. The personality becomes like a young green sprout at dawn, which gathers for itself life-giving crystal-clear dewdrops, which nourish it with moisture and stimulate its rapid growth and eventually allow it to become an independent plant. Daily work on yourself makes it possible to acquire spiritual experience in the invisible world, which gives an understanding of your past. For example, why states of depression, dissatisfaction with life, etc. took place. It becomes clear why man, wishing to be better, at the same time feels a nearly animal fear about anything that may threaten to change his usual way of life. With the help of spiritual tools, a person learns to control his thoughts and control his main four essences. Developing spiritually, he begins to understand the visible and the invisible worlds through the deepest feelings, already not from the perspective of his mind limited in matter, but from the perspective of the spiritual, intuitive knowledge, which covers a wider range of information about the world and makes it possible to maintain a constant connection with the soul, the portal to the world of God. Man's intentions in the attainment of the spiritual path become like a solid rock which cannot be moved by winds of doubt. Anastasia. Yes, daily practice helps to recognize and adjust yourself in the process of your spiritual journey. If you content yourself only with theory, this is like marking time, wasting life's valuable moments. As the ancients used to say, the one who soars towards spiritual summits gets ahead of the one who walks the path. The one who walks gets ahead of the one who crawls along the way of knowledge, and the one crawling gets ahead of the one who stands still. To make the first step means to start moving forward towards knowing yourself. Rigden. Quite true.